In the early years of World War II, when the United States was still wrestling with the painful contradictions of its own democracy, the story of the Tuskegee Airmen began to unfold, not as a simple tale of pilots learning to fly, but as a monumental struggle against the invisible walls of prejudice and doubt that hung like a shadow over every ambition these young men carried. And it was in Tuskegee, Alabama, a place itself steeped in the realities of segregation, where this extraordinary experiment was born, an experiment that many in the military and in the government secretly expected to fail, because the prevailing belief at the time, reinforced by decades of racist assumptions, was that African Americans simply did not have the intelligence, the courage, or the discipline to master the complexities of aviation, much less to excel in combat. And yet, despite these poisonous doubts, a group of young men stepped forward, driven by an unshakable determination to prove not only their individual worth, but also the worth of their entire community, to show a skeptical nation that patriotism, bravery, and excellence were not the sole property of one race, but qualities that belonged to human spirit itself. And so, they began their training at Tuskegee Army Airfield, under conditions that were as demanding as they were isolating, for the pressure they carried was unlike that borne by any other cadets in the country. For the white trainees, the challenge was to learn the aircraft, to master the maneuvers, to survive the grueling schedule of flight instruction and classroom lessons. But for the black trainees of Tuskegee, there was the added weight of knowing that every slip, every misstep, every failure would be seized upon as proof that the experiment was doomed, that the critics had been right all along. And so they endured not only the physical and mental demands of training, but also the unspoken expectation that they were carrying the hopes of an entire race upon their shoulders. Many did not make it through. The standards were high, and the washout rate was brutal. But those who did endure, those who proved themselves again and again, would go on to become some of the most celebrated pilots of the war. Their names etched forever into the history of aviation. But in those early days, they were just young men, often in their late teens or early 20s, learning to navigate not just the skies, but the treacherous realities of a segregated army and a divided nation. By 1943, after months of training and relentless pressure, the first groups of Tuskegee Airmen were sent overseas, where a true test awaited them. For it was one thing to fly over the field of Alabama under the watchful eyes of skeptical instructors, but it was quite another to take to the skies over North Africa, Italy, and eventually Germany, where the enemy was experienced, determined, and deadly. They began their combat missions flying Curtiss P-40 Warhawks, rugged aircraft that required skill and toughness to master, and though they were not the fastest or the sleekest planes in the sky, the airmen pushed them to their limits, proving themselves in missions that often demanded not only precision, but also nerves of steel, and soon they transitioned to more advanced aircraft, including the P-47 Thunderbolt and ultimately the P-51 Mustang, the plane that would become forever associated with their legacy, painted with bright red tails to set them apart. These P-51s would strike fear into the hearts of their enemies and comfort into the hearts of the bomber crews they escorted. For the Tuskegee Airmen quickly built a reputation as some of the most reliable and disciplined escort pilots in the European theater. While other fighter groups sometimes left their charges to chase the thrill of air-to-air combat, the Red Tails earned admiration by sticking close to their bombers, guiding them through swarms of German fighters, through flak-filled skies, through missions where the odds seemed almost impossible, and time after time, the bombers returned home, battered but alive, because the Red Tails had done their job. And soon the whispers began to circulate among the bomber crews. If you saw those Red Tails above you, you knew you were in good hands, and for the men flying those bombers thousands of feet above hostile territory, that knowledge was more valuable than gold, for it meant the difference between life and death. But this reputation was not built without sacrifice. Many of the airmen gave their lives in process, cut down in the prime of youth, their dreams left unfinished, their families left grieving, and yet their comrades pressed on, because they knew that their mission was larger than themselves, larger even than the war. For in every flight, in every engagement, they were not just fighting the Luftwaffe, they were fighting the very idea that their people were less than capable, less than equal, less than American, and that fight gave them a fire that no enemy could extinguish. The Tuskegee Airmen's journey was filled with contradictions that revealed the painful truths of America in the 1940s. Because while they soared above the clouds, defending freedom in Europe, their families back home were still barred from sitting at the same lunch counters, from using the same restrooms, from voting without fear, and from receiving even most basic respect from their fellow citizens. And that irony was not lost on the airmen themselves, who often returned from missions where they had risked everything, only to be treated as second-class citizens when they set foot back on American soil. Yet they never let bitterness define them, because they knew that their courage in the skies could become a weapon more powerful than any bullet or bomb, a weapon against the ignorance and prejudice that sought to keep them down. They were fighting two wars at once, the war against Nazi tyranny abroad and the war against systemic racism at home. And though victory in either seemed uncertain, they pressed on, because they understood that the struggle itself was worth everything, and in their sacrifice, they planted seeds of change that would blossom in the years to come. In combat, their record spoke for itself. They flew more than 15,000 sorties, destroyed over 260 enemy aircraft, sank enemy ships, demolished supply lines, and earned nearly 1,000 medals and commendations, including Distinguished Flying Crosses, Silver Stars, and Purple Hearts. And their success was not just measured in numbers, but in the lives they saved. For bomber crews return again and again to say that they owed their lives to the Red Tails, that they never felt safer than when the Tuskegee Airmen were by their side, and those testimonies became impossible to ignore, even for those who had once doubted them. Slowly, their achievements began to shift perceptions within the military and beyond, eroding the barriers of prejudice brick by brick, until even the most hardened skeptics had to admit that these men had done what many had thought impossible, and when war finally ended, though they returned to a nation still divided, their very presence, their very record, became a powerful argument for change. Within a few years, in 1948, President Harry Truman signed Executive Order 9981, officially desegregating the armed forces. And while that order was a result of many pressures and many voices, the undeniable success of the Tuskegee Airmen was one of its strongest foundations, for they had shown that segregation was not only unjust but also absurd, that talent and courage could be found in every corner of the nation, if only the walls of prejudice could be torn down. Their story did not end there, for in the decades that followed, the Tuskegee Airmen became living symbols of perseverance and hope, their example inspiring the broader civil rights movement. Their names and deeds held up as proof that change was possible, that the fight for equality could succeed. And today, their legacy lives on not just in museums and history books, but in the lives of every African-American pilot who followed in their footsteps in the integrated squadrons that now fly, proudly under the same flag, and an enduring truth that the measure of man is found not in the color of his skin, but in the depth of his character and the strength of his spirit. And when we think back to those bright red tails streaking across the sky, defending bombers, defying enemies, and defying prejudice all at once, we are reminded that history is not just made by battles and victories, but by the courage of individuals who refuse to accept the limits imposed upon them, who choose to rise above, who choose to soar. And the Tuskegee Airmen did just that, leaving behind a legacy that challenges us even now, decades later, to ask ourselves whether we are living up to the ideals for which they fought, whether we are honoring their sacrifice not just with words but with deeds, by striving for a world that is truly free, truly united. And so, their story remains not a relic of the past, but a living call to action, echoing across the skies they once ruled, urging us to remember that the greatest battles are not always fought with guns and planes, but with hearts and minds. And in that sense, the Tuskegee Airmen are still with us, guiding us, inspiring us, reminding us that no barrier is too strong to break, no prejudice too deep to overcome, and no dream too high to reach, so long as we have the courage to take flight.